Hey guys, welcome back. So now with us going on a bit of a symbiote frenzy, as well as a bit of a Spider-Man frenzy as well, but with doing this, I kind of figured it was a good time that we just get into the Red Goblin story and talk about how Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, had stolen the Carnage symbiote and became the Red Goblin. So with that being said, let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch your spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so pretty much where this starts from is Superior Spider-Man issue 31, where at this point Peter's returned to being himself after Otto Octavius had taken his body for some time. But at this point, with Peter returning in the Goblin Nation finale, where he goes after the Green Goblin, who had built a small army under the nose of Otto Octavius, whose focus had veered away from catching common criminals like Peter would've, and with doing so Norman Osborn had capitalized on that as the Green Goblin, to where he put together a small army, and then he revealed his plans to Peter about how he was setting up Alchemax to be this corporate giant which would last the Osborn family for generations. But then during this fight when Norman Osborn is unmasked, and with saying this like he may not look like the Norman that you're used to, but this had mainly stemmed from after the events on Siege on Asgard, to where he had then went to Monica Rappaccini so that he personally would have the powers of a super adaptoid and face the Avengers using their powers. But that didn't work out with him absorbing too many of their powers at the same time, which put him in a coma. But then after he was hospitalized, he had later escaped and got plastic surgery because the name and face of Norman Osborn at that point had gained too much attention. But with Peter unmasking him, it really wasn't for the point of knowing any of this, but instead he had removed his mask to bypass his Goblin protocols, which wouldn't let any of the Spider Tech attack either the Goblin or anything with his insignia on it. And with doing this, he injected Norman Osborn with the Goblin Cure, which was created by Otto Octavius during his time as Superior Spider-Man. But then it's after this where we see Norman Osborn go to his secret underground subway line, to where at this point, without the Goblin serum, not only is he depowered as far as having like regular strength, but also now he no longer has that Goblin insanity. And from the conclusion of Superior Spider-Man, with Norman Osborn just being his regular self, he had initially set out the idea that from there he was going to go after Spider-Man as the real Norman Osborn, rather than this laughing lunatic that's the Green Goblin. And laughing lunatic, those are his words. Personally, I like the Goblin laugh. Reminds me of the dad joke thing, like, you know, the or vice versa, however you want to think of it. But at this point in Amazing Spider-Man Volume 4, it's here where we find Norman, who's had his face fixed back to the Norman that we remember, although it be slightly disfigured after multiple surgeries at this point. But then it's here where we find Norman, who's trying to take a cranked up version of the Goblin serum, which could potentially kill thousands, but with the billions of nanites that Spider-Man had put into his system, Norman isn't able to just take the Goblin serum again, because every time he tries, the cure that Peter gave him, it just keeps rejecting it. And really what this showed us at the time is that with Norman being cured, he couldn't handle the silence, and he had just found himself desperate to get back that madness again. And from here, it just took him down this journey of trying a number of different scientific methods, and when that didn't work, he tried hypnosis, which of course didn't work as well. He even tried acupuncture, but time after time, and attempt after attempt, nothing happened. And so this is what then sent him on a journey to try to learn the mystical arts, in hopes to receive a similar type of success as Baron Mordo, Doctor Strange, or Victor Von Doom. But within the trial portion of his training, he was told to face his demons, and with doing so, he had this moment where he conjured Spider-Man, which was hilarious, might I say. But with undergoing this test to where eventually he did beat Spider-Man, but with doing this, his trainers, who went by the name of Ox, Snake, and Hawk, they had more or less observed the intention of what Norman Osborn wanted to do with his training, and it was from there where they immediately rejected him and just casted him out. And initially when this happened, Norman had seen it as rejection, but not long after, with just taking this experience for what it was, he had then instead taken it as confirmation of the Goblin still being inside of him, but he just has to do something to get it out. Which from there kind of led us into this moment that we'd seen in Marvel Legacy issue 1, when Norman tried to break into the Sanctum Sanctorum, but after getting jumped by the shrubbery, Doctor Strange was then alerted, and after that Norman Osborn had just had to dip out. But then later, moving further into Marvel Legacy, is here where we find that Norman Osborn had hired Miss Coleman and Dr. Crane to break into a high security location located under the Atlantic Ocean called the Lockbox. And with doing so, it was here that we found that the item he had sent them to retrieve was in fact none other than the Carnage symbiote. And for Norman, after trying so many different ways to get the madness back, which as he would describe would be everywhere on Earth that he could imagine, whether spiritually, surgically, or even using psychology, and not even to mention his attempts at either learning or stealing the use of the mystical arts, But with taking this method, he believed the result would be very much different, with the Carnage symbiote being unearthly in its nature. And immediately with him taking the Carnage symbiote on, he could sense the madness that was already in it. But initially during the bonding process, the Carnage symbiote, it began to make Norman say that he was going to tear Spider-Man apart, and after that, the rest of the world. And within the initial part of their bonding, the Carnage symbiote had wanted Norman Osborn to pretty much become just another version of Carnage. But with this happening, Norman told the symbiote, like, if death and suffering is what you want, I can give you that, to where then they just killed Miss Coleman and Dr. Crane. But with Norman telling the symbiote that he wanted to lead it away from being your conventional and usual Carnage, he had then let the symbiote know that he could show it new levels of destruction, along with new layers and textures of suffering. But with doing this, it would be under one condition, and that condition was that Norman is in the driver's seat. And with saying this, Norman told the symbiote, show me you understand, and it was right then when the symbiote fixed his disfigured face, and with doing so as a sign of compliance. And with seeing this, like, Norman was impressed, but then he was like, you know what, let's just take this a step further. And it was here where he told the Carnage symbiote about the nanites that Spider-Man had infected him with, which were keeping him from taking the Goblin serum, and he asked the Carnage symbiote, like, what can you do about that? And with saying this, the Carnage symbiote just made him cough him up. Which from there, with Norman free of these nanites, he could then take the Goblin serum again, which as a result would turn him into a hybrid of Green Goblin and the next Carnage. And so after this, with Norman successfully retaking the Goblin serum, we later come to find out that he's kidnapped J. Jonah Jameson. And with them doing this and questioning Jameson in order to figure out Spider-Man's connection to Mary J. Watson, his son Harry, and also to Liz Allen and Flash, with Norman believing that once he's cracked this puzzle, then he'll finally have the leverage that he needs to get rid of Spider-Man. But during this time, also while Norman Osborn was interrogating more or less J. Jonah Jameson, we had then had this case to where the Goblin King, he had made his way into one of the lower levels, and really at this point essentially just to re-up on some Goblin weapons. But with Norman hearing this and confronting Philip Urich, the Goblin King, he essentially told him that he was ungrateful, and Norman was like, oh, so this is how you repay me? After I took you under my wing, made you my knight? And in response, the Goblin King told Norman that he knows what Spider-Man did to him, with him injecting Norman with nanites and taking away his strength. And it's from that where Urich was pretty much like, look, I'm nobody's knight anymore. I've taken on the name, the Goblin King. And when he goes to strike Norman with a killing blow, Norman just catches the blade with his hand and he rips the Goblin King's heart out. Which from there kind of had me thinking like, well, Philip Urich just went to hell, like, dang man, I totally misread that situation. But then after this, when Norman then goes back to Jameson, and with doing so he's suiting back up in his Goblin attire, and from here Jameson just goes on to tell Norman how this isn't going to do him any good because Norman has already put Spider-Man through the worst by throwing his girl off of a bridge. And when Jameson says this, it clicks for Norman, and it's here where he remembers that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, which mind you at this point, this is something that Jameson did not want to give up, which really just points back to how he found out about Peter's identity in Spectacular Spider-Man, to where at the time, after he admitted to Spider-Man that the only reason that he hated him, it was because it was all that Jameson had, after losing his father and after losing his wife. And at that time when he confessed this to Spider-Man, Peter revealed his identity, and really just doing so to comfort Jameson and let him know that he's not alone. But now with Norman remembering that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, he then takes his attack to the Daily Bugle. And when he gets there and he sees Peter, he tells him to go get Spider-Man, while also threatening Peter by telling him if he doesn't, everyone there's gonna die. But then also with doing this and bringing this stolen tritium to the Bugle to blow this place up, in a very messed up way, Norman taunts Ben Urich by telling him that he found his nephew Phil and letting him know that his head is also in the bag. But of course with saying this, not so much in a literal sense as much as him just saying that Philip Urich, the Goblin King, is dead. But then when Peter gets back as Spider-Man, Ben tells Spider-Man like the place is gonna blow up. And in response, he just tells Ben to get everybody out of there. But then also to minimize the blast of this bomb, Peter then webs a cocoon all around it, and with doing so immediately after, he creates a cocoon for himself, but not so much for Norman. Worry about yourself. But then with the bomb going off and Norman being impaled within the blast and in the debris, and with this happening, Peter tells Norman that he wishes that this could have been different. He wishes he could have saved him. But then in a very be careful what you wish for kind of manner, it's here where Norman then reveals to Peter that he has the Carnage symbiote, and with doing so he takes the form of Red Goblin for the first time. And when this happened, Peter's response was priceless. But after the initial shock, like, he just had to get out of there. So with him practically spamming the evade button, he then plants a spider tracer on Norman and he makes his way out of there. But before he gets into the clear, Norman then catches him with one of his Carnage bombs, which are like laughing while they're in the air, but then one of them bites Peter in the leg and then it explodes, taking him down and out of the fight. And with this happening and it leaving the two of them more or less at this standstill, Norman then takes the spider tracer off of his back and he speaks into it, giving Peter an ultimatum. And he tells Peter to give it up now and forever, and to stop being Spider-Man and he'll let him live. But then if not, if he doesn't, Norman's kind of like, you know, if I catch you climbing up one more wall, this shit is over. I'm going for Mary Jane, Aunt May, Betty, Robbie, Jonah, your dentist, your mailman, everybody's gonna get it. But also with saying this, or more or less things of this nature, Norman had then told Peter to show me a sign to let me know that you understand. And as a sign, Peter hung up his uniform in flames because he knew at this point, facing Norman Osborn, the Red Goblin, like there's nothing Peter could do. Not to mention he's still hurt from essentially being bit in the leg by a grenade. But even with Peter stepping down as Spider-Man for the moment, while also sustaining this heavy injury to his left leg, he had then figured that the way that he could still protect his loved ones would be by reaching out to a number of his other hero friends like Johnny Storm, Flash Thompson, Clayton Cole, Silk, and really just whoever he could reach at short notice so they could patrol nearby everyone who was in danger, since Peter had made this recent agreement with Norman Osborn. But as it turned out, instead of Norman going after Peter's friends and loved ones, we had then found that Norman had went after his own family, with him following Liz and Harry to the Port Authority of New York. And when Norman revealed himself here, this got the attention of Clay Cole, or Clash, who spotted Norman but he didn't want to engage because he's like, hey, this dude's out of my league. But then soon after, when Johnny shows up, together they both go after the Red Goblin using a combined attack of both fire and sonic pulses, which did absolutely nothing. And with seeing this clash, like right away, he's like, man, screw this, I'm out of here. But with this happening, or really nothing happening, Norman just tells them that their attacks didn't take any effect because together, the Goblin Serum along with the symbiote, they make him the perfect hybrid with all the strengths and no weaknesses. And for Peter, more or less hearing what's happening over the comms, he told everyone not to engage, but instead of listening to Peter, everybody engaged. And when they did, it was all bad. Like Norman was just handing out fatal injuries for everyone. And with Peter monitoring this, he immediately suited up and made his way down there. But even while Peter was still on his way, Flash had made it there first. And as soon as Flash got there, he hit Norman with the anti-venom symbiote killing antibodies, getting him to bubble up. I don't know what it is about that just tickles me. But for Flash, before he could stop Norman, he had then given Flash the ultimatum to where Flash could either stay here and kill him, or he can go and help his friends. And of course, Flash chose to help his friends because they were barely hanging on to life. And it's one of those situations to where if he had stayed holding on to Norman, then a number of these guys could have just died just waiting. But of course, Norman did this to get Flash's guard down, and it worked. And Peter was trying to tell Flash like to keep his guard up because he's doing exactly what Norman Osborn wants him to do. But practically, Flash let Peter know that he has to take that chance because if he doesn't, a number of these guys could just die out here. And with Peter hearing this and still trying to get there as fast as he could, and mind you, still with that hurt leg, which I'm pretty sure hurts every time he kicks the swing. But with Peter rushing to get there, it isn't in time before Norman slices Flash from behind, taking him down and wounding him critically. But before Norman finishes Flash, he notices that he's lost sight of Harry and Liz, and he just leaves from Flash to go back after his family again. And when Norman leaves, it's here where Peter shows up and barely able to even stand on his leg. But with him arriving and the other heroes here still alive thanks to Flash, it's here where Flash then reaches for Peter's injured leg, and with the last bit of energy that he has, he heals Peter's injury so that he can get back in the fight and go after Norman Osborn. But then when we go back to Norman, it's here where we see that he's caught up with both Liz and Harry, and with finding them, he immediately grabs his grandson Normie, and he bonds him with a piece of the Carnage symbiote. But with that said, I think we'll just stop this one here because what happens after this, I feel like it really needs its own video. So if you're new here, stay tuned for that because I feel like we've been talking about symbiotes like the whole year. Alright, so picking up from where we left off, with Norman Osborn bonding his grandson Normie, to a piece of the Carnage symbiote, it's here where we then go over to the rest of the heroes, where at this point Flash has already healed Peter's leg, but as far as everyone else who Flash did get to in time, they're still in a state of recovery with having spikes lodged into them, amongst other things, but enough has been done at this point to where they'll survive. But then just before Peter leaves, Silk then tells him that J. Jonah Jameson, he's reached out, and he's saying how that he can help, or really more so at this point that he needs to help, but Peter says no because Jameson's the reason why he's in this mess to begin with. And that just goes back to what we had talked about when Norman Osborn had kidnapped Jameson, and Jameson accidentally reminded Norman that he'd killed Gwen Stacy, which at the time is what threw all of this back into play. But then also, like when we talked about when Peter had made the deal with the Red Goblin to where Peter steps down as Spider-Man, then Norman won't go after any of Peter's family or friends. But then it was also here in issue 799 where Flash had told Peter he already found Jameson while Peter was trying to get the word out. So at that point Peter was like, okay cool, just keep an eye on him. But then when Flash had turned around, it was only to find out that Jameson had already put his Stacey Adams in sport mode and he dipped out. And when we see Jameson next, it goes into the last time we had seen him and Peter speak, really. Because for Jameson, after dipping on Flash, he had then went home and called Peter. But with Peter being pretty much Oracle at this point, like first person came to mind, I don't know. But with him being the guy in the chair and trying to facilitate as many people as he can, he just tells Jameson that Norman knows his identity again, he doesn't know how, and it's here where Jameson had told Peter that it was because of him, that he had slipped up, and everything that's happening that is his fault. And when Jameson said this, Peter had just looked at him, and he hung up. Because like we talked about, man, like when Peter told Jameson his identity, it was a very vulnerable moment between the two of them. So with Peter finding this out now, I'd only imagine that he's just hurt and frustrated and pissed, like just all wrapped up into one. But then also for Jameson, with this happening, it set up the need for him to have to make this right. But then on the flip side for Peter, he feels like Jameson, he's done enough. But then in the case of Peter, after telling Silk that he doesn't want Jameson's help, he then tells Flash to stay back and take care of the others. And it's right after that when he's waved down by Harry and Liz, who let him know right away that the Goblin has taken Normie and he's bonded him with a piece of the Carnage symbiote. But with Norman and Normie nowhere in sight, Peter really just doesn't know where to start. But then it's here where Harry and Liz tell him that they know where Norman will be later on, since he's given them till sundown to hand over Alchemax. And with that alone, it gives Peter an idea of when and where he'll find the Goblin later on. But then as far as figuring out a solution on how to stop the Goblin, it's here where Peter then asks Mark Raxton, who's head of security at Alchemax, if they got any more of the artificial anti-venom, and he's kind of like, well, we're not supposed to, but and that right there just lets Peter know like, yeah, y'all got it. But after that, Mark then gives him the heads up that they moved it to the new location, which used to be Horizon Labs. So right away Peter just rushes over there so he can get some anti-venom ASAP and use it against the Goblin. But then also in the case of Jameson, who's trying to find a way to help and make it right, and it's here where he comes up with the idea that you gotta fight fire with fire, and in order to stop someone with the symbiote, you gotta call somebody else with the symbiote. And with Venom being the first person who comes to mind, Jameson figures out his identity pretty quick. Because with Peter Parker being a newspaper photographer with powers, it makes him think like, man, maybe Eddie did the same thing. He then looks at it like, well, nah, it can't be that simple. Or could it? And right after that, he's just like, scammers, they're both scammers. But with figuring this out, he calls the number of Mr. Sim, which is the pseudo name that all the photography of Venom has been taken under. And when he calls his number, Jameson knows it's Eddie. Like just off of the voice alone. But when Eddie picks up, Jameson's kind of like, huh, Mr. Sim, what's your first name? B.O.? Like you gotta admit, J. Jonah got him with that one. But essentially what Jameson does is he threatens Eddie, like, look, I know your identity and you're gonna do me a favor or I'm just gonna let the cat out the bag. But he does let Eddie know that it's for a good cause, and I'm not sure if that helped, but from there Eddie let him know that they're in. But then it's here where we catch up with Peter, who's at the new Alchemax location, which used to be the Horizon Labs building. And even though it's been renovated and remodeled up top, the foundations are still the same, including the secret tunnels that Morbius used to use, so Peter uses them to make his way inside. But when he gets in, it's only to find out that the Goblin has already been there, and because of that there's no anti-venom to be found, which right away just kills Peter's plan of mixing it with his web fluid, which then kind of has him like, okay, what now? But then just after this, when he's spotted by one of Norman's symbiote pumpkin bombs, Norman then tells him that he sees Peter and that Peter broke their deal, and because of that he's going for Peter's family, starting with MJ. But in response, Peter did have a valid argument with saying that technically Norman broke the deal because he told Peter that he wasn't going to go after his family or his loved ones, which include Harry, Liz, and Normie. But the Goblin was just like, no, that's my family. You're in violation and I'm going for MJ. And so then from here heading over to MJ at Stark Tower, to where at this point point, she's working as Tony Stark's personal assistant during the time of Invincible Iron Man, and this arrangement was mainly offered by Tony because he had destroyed her club, the Jackpot, in Chicago. But then while MJ's here, Eddie Brock comes crashing in, and initially when this happens she doesn't know what to make of it, but at a first glance she assumes that it's Norman Osborn, so right away she triggers the alert for the fire in the Sonics. But even still with doing this, when she sees that it's Venom, she still leaves it on because he just crashed through the window unannounced, so to her it's like there's no telling what he's here for. But with Eddie in excruciating pain, he tries to tell MJ that he's here to help. But with Eddie getting hit by the fire and the Sonics, this really just leaves an opening for the Goblin to just fly right in. But with Norman getting there and Eddie fighting him off, it's pretty clear that Venom is there to help. But with the fire and the Sonics still going, which as a reminder do not harm the Goblin at this point at all. But with these defenses still going, Eddie's kind of like, look, you could turn it off now. Because really Eddie's the only one getting hurt. But then from here we then jump over to Aunt May, who at this point at her apartment, she has a knock on the door and it's Normie. And when she sees him, he's looking all cute and lost, so of course she lets him in. But with seeing him there, she's like, I gotta call your mother Liz, because she's gotta be worried. And as soon as she turns her back, Normie jumps to go after her, but then right away he's stopped by these arm tentacles that seem like they had just came out of nowhere. But of course with this happening is Otto Octavius, who at this point is the Superior Octopus. And I believe a while back we had talked about like a summary of Superior Spider-Man and also Otto becoming Superior Octopus, either around the time we were talking Spider-Geddon or Secret Empire. But even just thinking about it now, I feel like he needs some of his own videos, because at times I'll make references and then low-key do a video inside of a video, and it just has me thinking about a lot of things we should just go back and cover. But either way, when Otto shows up here, and for the record, he also was that mysterious person in the green trench coat who we had seen briefly in Amazing Spider-Man issue 799, watching the different heroes watch over Peter's loved ones, and that's how he knew to look after Aunt May. But then back over at the Stark Tower, Peter gets there and he sees Venom, and right away he's thrown off because it's kind of like, why are you here? But with Peter showing up, first thing he does is check on MJ, who at this point is equipping her repulsor glove so that she can help out with a bit of this too. But also I gotta say, like, with just talking about this, it just has me thinking of the many changes that MJ has gone through the years, whether it be actress, model, club owner, or just waking up one day and having freckles. Like, MJ is literally every woman. But then Eddie kind of breaks up this conversation because he's like, look guys, I see that y'all talking, y'all having this moment, but I'm hurting here. I barely got anything left. And when Peter jumps back in, he then starts to think of like, well, what can he do next? Or what is the plan that's gonna actually stop the Goblin? And as Peter's thinking, like, every living, breathing thing has a weakness, he's then like, that's it, breathing. And with thinking that, he goes from punching the Goblin in the face to punching him in the neck, which by the way hurts for anyone who's fortunate enough not to know. But this then doesn't work for Peter for too long, because Goblin just catches that arm and just bites him, which then causes MJ to panic and hit the Goblin with a repulsor blast. But this then ended up hurting Peter and Eddie more than it did Norman. But then also with this happening, it gave the Goblin a clean shot to go for MJ, and with doing so he then hits her with like the symbiote spike attack, much like he did with everyone else. And from here he then leaves to go after his grandson Normie, who at this point has deemed himself the Goblin child. That kid's scarred for life. But with leaving, Norman tells Peter that he left Normie to go after Aunt May, to where at this point she's probably dead by now. So he's like, he's gonna pick up his grandkid, and after that he's coming back for MJ. But when the Goblin leaves, Eddie's like, look man, like, you need to take my symbiote. And of course initially Peter's just like, no, or better yet, no way in hell. But then when MJ tells him that it's probably a good idea, with Aunt May being in danger and there's really no time to really try to cook up or prepare a better plan. But with this happening, Peter redons the symbiote, and as he heads to Aunt May's apartment, he once again feels that faster, better, stronger feeling. But then also with him redonning the symbiote this time, it looks different, and much that has to do with it having been with Flash and also Eddie, and the symbiote learning to be good after it was discarded by Peter. But then it's also here while Peter's heading over to Aunt May's apartment, where we see Flash, who's rushed everyone to the hospital because the anti-venom alone is not working. And it's like, sure, he's able to keep these guys alive, but even still something's not quite right. But then while Peter's en route to Aunt May's apartment, he gets a call from J. Jonah Jameson, and it's here where Jameson lets him know like he's trying to help and that he already had sent someone to help MJ, which is how Peter finds out about who called Eddie. But then Peter just hangs up on Jameson again, telling him like, dude, you've done enough, stop helping. But then over at Aunt May's apartment with Otto and Normie just tearing the place apart, Aunt May then steps in and breaks a chair over Normie's head, which for her it's a little funny because when Otto had first got there, she was like, Otto, oh my god, what are you doing? He's just a kid. And then when the kid turned into Goblin Child, that's when Aunt May then chimed in with the chair upside the kid's head. But then it's funny because we get this moment where she's like, I baked cookies for you. Like, how could you do this, Normie? And in response, Normie is then like, you put raisins in them. You deserve to die. And when he said that back at the time, I was just like, damn Sly, you a wild boy. But then it's here where J. Jonah then steps in with the Spider Slayer, which is also something we've seen return more recently within Spider-Man Spider Shadow, although with that being a different universe altogether. But then much like I mentioned in that video, Jameson's not a stranger to this thing. But when Jameson steps in, he attacks Normie and Otto. And with doing so, assuming that Otto was working with the Goblin, but also with making that mistake, he also sets himself up to be alone versus the Goblin when he shows up, which ultimately leaves him and Otto defeated and Aunt May there just by herself, and the Goblin ready to leave a deadly message for Peter Parker. And shortly after, when Peter finally gets there, he approaches Aunt May's apartment only to see the Goblin leaving at this point. So already he's like, oh no, I'm too late. And when he gets inside and he sees the Spider Slayer, which is completely just wrecked, with Jameson on the screen saying he tried to help, he tried his best, but then Peter just crushes the screen because he's not trying to hear it. But then as a result, with Jameson, who is just desperate to make things right, he then just grabs his gun and he walks out the door. But with Peter getting to Aunt May's apartment, what he finds here is that Otto leaped in the way, saving Aunt May at the last second, which at this point with Otto, it still has a lot to do with him still having Peter's memories, which started in Superior Spider-Man, but is still very much the case here with his new body of the Proto-Clone, which is a hybrid of both Otto and Peter. But even before any of that, Otto by himself, he had always had a level of care and respect for Aunt May, even though through the years him and Peter have had their differences. But then with Peter leaving here to go after the Goblin, Aunt May tells him to look after that kid Normie, because when it's all said and done, he's just a kid, and he really doesn't know what he's doing. But then it's after this when we then get to Alchemax, where at this point Norman and Normie, they're making their way in at sundown in order to finalize the agreement, or demand more or less, for Liz to hand over her company. But then when Norman gets here, he only sees Liz and Mark Raxton, which initially has him thinking like, okay, well maybe Harry just didn't have the stomach to show up. But then with Liz showing Norman the huge stack of paperwork, she lets him know that there's no way she could just hand him the company in a matter of days, weeks, or even months. And she tells him like, what do you think this is, Parker Industries? And I'm sure if Otto was here, he would feel highly disrespected at that statement. But then it's here where Norman shows the face of Mason Banks, who like we talked about before is like the identity he had posed as when he first came back and he was working for Alchemax. And with doing this, he tells Liz that he knows the ins and outs of this company. And as it turns out, they have a beneficiary clause and an all or nothing trust, so that if anything happens, the company and the funds go down to Normie, with the inclusion of his surviving legal guardian. And with saying this, Norman is pretty much like, well look, this is anything is happening. And right away, Liz tries to reason with Normie and let him know like, this is what your grandfather's been planning. He wants to kill your parents and build this twisted legacy. But then also with doing this, she clicks a button and she calls in Harry. And right away he comes in with an old Goblin glider and a bunch of Humanitrons from Humanitech, and he just swoops in and he grabs Normie. But even with this happening, Normie still feels a bit of resentment for his father from the time that Harry had disappeared after becoming the Goblin and after he died, which had just played into a number of events that led Normie to believe that his father didn't want him. And with Harry having another son, Stanley, later on with a different mother, Normie had then felt like that was the son that Harry loved. And back at this time, we had still saw Normie dealing with that. But regardless of his past and his decisions, Harry has always loved Normie. And when he tells Normie here that he's not letting go, he's not giving up on his family, Normie notices that. He notices his dad Harry fighting for his family. But while this is happening, it's here where Norman then grabs Liz and throws her through the window, while saying, what is it with me and blondes in high places? And man, I gotta tell you, like, Norman Osborn is the worst, man. And when he throws Liz through the window, like, it's here where Normie gets to see that, like, firsthand, by witnessing with his grandfather that there's really no limit with this guy. And Norman's response after doing this, it's pretty much just boo hoo hoo, grow up, kid. But then when Peter swings in after catching Liz, it's like it's here where the heroic music just comes in. Like, cue my favorite Spider-Man song from Nickelback. But then it's here for Normie where he then realizes like, dang, granddaddy, you ain't shit. Like, you legit try to kill mom. And with seeing this, Normie tries to go after him, which of course he's not going to overpower him. But fortunately, Peter's able to stop Norman and save his godson. But then right after, Harry then races for Norman with the glider, and right away Peter holds Norman like, oh yeah baby, here we go. And Harry just jumps off the glider, allowing it to impale Norman again. And really, this has me thinking, like, when Norman Osborn came back and he had implemented the whole thing with the Goblin protocols, like, he should have hunted down every glider on the face of the earth and just made sure that the Goblin protocols was loaded on them before doing anything else. But with this happening, it creates this real emotional moment between Harry, Normie, and Liz, with them fighting to stay together, and that Harry meant what he said when he told Normie that he was never gonna let him go. And with this taking place, like, Norman, he's effectively lost his grandson, in spite of Normie still having a piece of the Carnage symbiote. But as far as his plans that we'd seen with him building this legacy for Normie and doing it the Goblin way, like, that's practically done, because at this point his whole family's turned against him. But then after this, when he then goes after Peter then begins to lead Norman away, and it's here where right away Norman notices that Peter's doing the whole lead away thing, like, we've done this dance before. But then when Peter taunts Norman, telling him that he's ineffective and that he said he was going to kill his family and loved ones, but that hasn't happened. And it's here where Norman's like, oh, hasn't it? And it's here where he then drops his backup plan on Peter, which then goes back to every symbiote shard that he has shot into everyone prior to this point, which he still has control of. And he lets Peter know, like, in the snap of a finger, he can make all these shards shoot up into their brains, killing everyone at one time, but then also causing them to suffer with the most excruciating pain. And when he tells this to Peter, he then snaps his finger, but nothing happens. And he knows this because he would also, through this connection, feel their suffering and feel their agony. But when nothing happens, he immediately thinks that Peter had did something with the little spider bugs. And Norman's like, was it the bugs? But then when Flash shows up with the number of the shards, it's just kind of like, boom, you looking for this? And it's here where Flash lets him know that from when he noticed Clash having a bad reaction to the Goblin's attack, he had then went to everyone else who was affected, and he had used what anti-venom he could in order to ease their pain and remove these shards. Which right away just has Peter like, alright, Corporal Eugene Thompson for the win. But then this whole moment is cut short when the Goblin sends his glider to bite Peter on the arm and fly away with him. And with the Goblin doing this and diving in after Flash, Flash immediately hits him with the anti-venom attack, which at this point is effectively killing the Carnage symbiote. But with Peter being pulled away, he tells Flash to hang in there, he'll get back to him as soon as he can. But even with Flash weakening the Carnage symbiote, he's still dealing with Norman Osborn with the Goblin serum. And because of that, with it being this weakened Flash against Norman Osborn with the serum, Norman's then able to bring Flash within inches of his life. And when Peter sees this, he loses it, and he practically turns into Venom, and he just destroys the symbiote infused glider. And so now with seeing this, I do want to say, like, we've talked about dark versions of Peter Parker, either with or without the symbiote. And I've noticed that a number of times there's kind of been this debate in the comments on whether any of those were Peter Parker becoming Venom, and none of the ones that we covered are. But this right here, this is one of those times. And with Peter becoming Venom here, he literally punches the Red Goblin into another zip code. And I'm talking about like on some Superman, punched through the buildings. Like the power he shows just initially, like, it's nuts. But even when this happens, it's not something that we get for long, because Flash, he then begs Peter to calm down because the Venom symbiote, it's good now. And Flash knows because he was a part of making that happen. And he tells Peter, like, don't let your rage infect the symbiote and be the reason that it turns bad again. And this is what then causes Peter to will it back in and tend to Flash. And he even makes a suggestion on giving Flash the Venom symbiote in order to help him. But Flash tells him no, because that could also kill the Venom symbiote, to where then Peter wouldn't really have a chance to go after Norman. And right now, Peter needs every advantage that he can get. But then Flash also tells Peter that the people need him, because the Goblin, he's now been knocked into Times Square, and Flash tells him that the people need Peter Parker, the Amazing Spider-Man, his hero, his friend. And with saying these last words, Flash dies in Peter's arms. But then over in Times Square, because the Goblin, he's been like en route this whole time. But with the Goblin, when he lands in Times Square, initially people think like he's part of some movie set, because really this whole thing of him being the Red Goblin is still fairly new. But then also he's mistaken for someone who's just dressing up to do gigs, and then this guy who's dressed up like Spider-Man, he tells the Goblin to get out of there, with this particular area being his corner. And I don't know specifically what he means by that, but I do know that the Goblin doesn't want him here either, like in the land of the living, with him seeing this guy in a Spider-Man costume and then going for the instant kill. But then it's here where Peter shows up and he's highly upset about the death of Flash, and then the Goblin just killing this random person for no reason. And it's here where Norman more or less has like an aha moment, and he tells Peter that he now realizes that he never really had to throw Gwen Stacy off of a bridge. And I wish he would have just took a second and just told us, like, was it the George Washington Bridge or the Brooklyn Bridge? Like, I'm asking for a friend, because that question's been going back and forth for years now. But it's here where he tells Peter that he now realizes that he didn't have to kill Gwen Stacy because Peter cares about everyone. And with realizing this, he then goes full griefer mode, like down at Times Square, and he just lets out symbiote pumpkin bombs on everybody in every direction, which at that point then causes Peter to go in every kind of Witcher way to try to save as many people as he can. But then also with doing this, there's wreckage, there's explosions, there's chaos, which then brings him to the point of losing the Goblin, to whom, with the symbiote, he's then able to get the drop on Peter without triggering his spider sense. And when this happens, like in this moment, it's almost like this is it. The heat from all the wreckage is crazy, so Peter's symbiote can barely take it, and the Goblin has now got the choke on Peter, so Peter's now scrambling like, what am I gonna do? But then when the Goblin says like, this is finally it, this is his moment of triumph, this is Norman Osborn victorious, but this is also what causes Peter to realize the Goblin's weakness, which for Norman is his pride. And it's here where Peter tells him like, no, this isn't it, because if you kill me now, the credit's gonna go to the Carnage symbiote, which from there is just gonna go back to Cletus Cassidy. And when Peter says this, it messes Norman up, because you then see Cletus Cassidy in his eyes, and it's here where Peter tells Norman that you gotta face me one-on-one without the symbiote. You let go of yours, I let go of mine, because if we do this any other way, there's pretty much gonna be like an asterisk over your win. And when this happens, Peter lets go of the Venom symbiote and he tells him to get out of here, get away from this heat. And when the Venom symbiote leaves, like it's so adorable here, like like you can tell in its expression that it misses Peter. But with Peter letting the Venom symbiote go, now it's just him standing here, ready to face off against the Green Goblin, not the Red Goblin. Which in this case, with Peter going first, like it's really bold, and it kind of sends a statement like, Norman, you're not gonna win. But then for Norman, because of his pride, he then strips off the Carnage symbiote, and he also lets it go, telling it that he doesn't need it, because now he's ready to prove, and like truly prove, that he can beat Spider-Man solely as the Green Goblin with nothing else. And when they go at it, like Peter, he's laying into this guy. And of course with using his restraint, because he still doesn't want to kill him, so Peter's practically using his fighting style like the way of the PG-13. But while they're fighting, fire then catches on this gas tank on a car nearby, triggering Peter's spider sense, then blowing up and more or less turning the tide of the fight. And it's really messed up because prior to this, Peter was winning and he was laying into the Goblin because he knew after all of this, like this was his chance. And with the Goblin getting the upper hand, he totally takes advantage of it. And when he does, he then starts to brag, telling Peter that all his friends are down or dead and it's because of him. But then also because of that, he tells Peter that no one's coming to save him. And it's right then when Peter gets the upper hand. And he tells the Goblin that his friends and his family, they're always with him in everything that he does. Like with his Uncle Ben, a man without powers who had taught him about courage, as well as Gwen Stacy's father who had taught Peter about sacrifice. And it's here where Peter lets him know like everyone in his life has given him a reason for him to never stop fighting. And really, it's moments like these right here where when people ask like, why is Spider-Man so big? Or how did he make it into like your top 5 biggest superheroes of all time? To where really the argument floats around Spider-Man, Superman, and Batman. But when people ask this question, you just gotta let them know. Spider-Man's struggles, his grit, his tenacity, like it just hits different. But Peter even goes on to tell Norman that his friends even give him something to live up to where this time he's referencing the late Flash Thompson. But then with Norman getting the mess beat out of him, he then calls for the Carnage symbiote to come back. And right away, Peter's like, nah, we ain't doing that again. And it's here when Peter takes the opportunity while the two of them are still separate. And with them being separate, they still have their weaknesses. So he reaches for a remaining piece of that burning gas tank and he smashes it just right on top of the symbiote in order to cause another explosion, which just blows him and Norman into the sky. But then it's here to where after things have settled to where Jameson arrives and he makes it clear he came here to shoot Norman Osborn and end this for good. And he tells Peter like if he doesn't do this, Norman is just gonna come back and more people are gonna get killed, and next time it could be Betty, Robbie, Aunt May, his son, or even him. And with saying this, he then squeezes the trigger, but then only for Peter to jump in front of the bullet and take the shot that was supposed to kill Norman Osborn. And when this happens and Jameson asks Peter like, why would you do that? And it's here where he tells Jameson that he had to because he could. Because with great power comes great responsibility, and that goes for everyone, even the worst of us. And from there, Jameson just drops the gun and he takes off. But then it's from here where Norman Osborn is then taken to Ravencroft, to where at this point we find out that his mind is pretty much fried. Because when Peter gets a moment alone with them to more or less see if Norman has told anyone his secret, and it's here where Norman Osborn tells Peter, I know your secret, you're Norman Osborn. And when he says that, Peter's kind of like, well then who are you? And in response, Norman tells him that he is Cletus Cassidy. And it's then when Peter just turns around like, okay, we're good here. Cause he knows the secret is safe, because no one's gonna believe this guy, even if he actually did remember. But then also I'd say if you wanna follow up with Norman Osborn from here, his story picks up in Absolute Carnage, and I got that link below. But then also, just to wrap this up, there are a few other things that kind of take place here. Because it's here where we then go to Alchemax Red Labs in upstate New York, to where Liz and Harry have taken Normie to Dr. Steven, to where they then put him through a process in order to get the symbiote that he was bonded with extracted. And even though Harry was like, once you get that thing out, destroy it, but then Liz was like, no, let's keep it in case Normie has complications. And when the process is done, she tells Mark to lock the symbiote up somewhere safe and private. But even still, there's kind of like this eerie vibe of what y'all really want to do with that thing. But then on top of that, we also get this eerie reminder that the whole situation with Normie and the symbiote, it's not over, which is something we also see come back up later on in Absolute Carnage. But then it's also here where we get the funeral of Corporal Flash Thompson, which is done really well in my opinion for a number of reasons, whether it being from Betty's speech to Peter's speech, and just with the way how Peter talks about when Flash was a bully, but bullies don't come out of nowhere, and how Peter didn't find out about why Flash had became a bully until later in life. But then for Peter, he goes a bit deeper and he talks around the details here. But when he then gets into how Flash was inspired to join the military, which for Flash was because of Spider-Man, who had inspired Flash to save and help people. But then on the flip side, with Peter seeing Flash going forward and fighting for his country, this had then helped Peter at a moment in his life where he had become the bully. And it just really shows how the two of them had just made such a huge impact on each other's lives. In many ways, neither of them knowing until later. But then also I like that we get this moment between Peter and Jameson, to where they're at least able to smooth things out, because when Aunt May tells Peter to go over and talk to Jameson, with them practically being like family because of her history with Jameson's father, and in this moment J. Jonah, he just doesn't need to be shut out. And so when Peter and him get to talk and Peter tells him like, look, no hard feelings, and it helps because Jameson just goes back to being the nice Jameson, or his version of that. Because when they then hear sirens going off and he tells Peter he needs to go, or tells Peter that he's needed, and it's like right away you can tell they're back on good terms. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so we can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. And I do also want to say that there's another Red Goblin, Red Death story that it came out like in 2019, and it tried to go back and tell the story of like when Norman Osborn had initially bonded with the Carnage symbiote, but I definitely had left that out for this one, and I'm pretty sure no one would be disappointed about that. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.